You see, we'll each find it differently. It takes many forms. And even in 2020, with its pandemic storms, is it moments with family, food, or a toy that sparks just that moment, the arrival of joy? But this year seems strange, alternative, different. Maybe no family for Christmas, at best socially distant. I guess there's a question we have to employ. Do we look in the right place for the arrival of joy? If ever there was a time for an arrival, an advent, surely it's this winter of discontent. Is there hope to be found, or are you barely surviving? Maybe that's why you're seeking for where joy is arriving. It's supposed to be the time for parties and gladness, and yet we're isolating, locked down with test and trace madness. Hope's pinned on a vaccine to seek and destroy, but is a miracle drug the arrival of joy? Is there more to our problem than worldwide pandemic? This isn't academic polemic, the problem is systemic. We might cover our sadness with Christmas as a decoy, but deep inside we long for the arrival of joy. We want joy that's unbridled, that springs from within, not your Insta, the instant, the fickle quick win, stuffed Bublé, Mariah, and the Christmas home driving. None of these signal the true joy arriving. So is there more to this season than gifts and mulled wine? It's a cliche, I know, and you'll guess the next line. But the truth is, the real arrival of joy was 2,000 years ago and a stable-born boy. You can't speak of stable when the world's anything but. Health, jobs, relationships, nothing's clear cut. So come listen to some truth as the real McCoy. The story of Jesus. The arrival of joy.
Good morning, everybody. My name's Dave. I'm leading us through the next part in our series of the arrival of joy, thinking about what it means for Jesus's birth that Christians all over the world have celebrated at this time of year for centuries means in terms of the arrival of joy. Festive season is fully in the air now, isn't it? We were putting up lights around our house last night. Festive season also means movie season. And in my opinion, the most emotional 7 minutes in the history of movies is the opening montage in Disney Pixar's Up. If you haven't seen it, it's the story of two young people named Carl and Ellie who meet when they're very young and they fall in love. They come from massively different family backgrounds. Ellie is loud and vivacious and noisy. Carl is quiet and a listener and an introvert. They fall in love and they get married and have ahead of them a life full of dreams and hopes. The hope of starting their own family someday, the dream of adventuring around the world together. But life comes along full of disappointments. They find out tragically that they are unable to have children. The pressure of bills and of the limits of money and everyday life come hitting day after day. And so the adventure that they had long hoped for just never happens. Hopes turned into disappointments. But even amongst all those disappointments, they could still hold on to the hope that they had in one another, the joy of the love that they shared with one another. But even that glimmering last flicker of hope fades away eventually. Ellie becomes ill and she never recovers. Carl is left alone. And in his aloneness, in all of the myriad of disappointments that life has thrown at him, he becomes bitter. It's not just Pixar movies that tell the stories of people faced with disappointment and becoming bitter, though, is it? In the Old Testament book of Ruth, the story of Ruth begins with the story of another woman named Naomi. Naomi, after losing her husband and her 2 sons and being left in poverty, says this: "Do not call me Naomi anymore. Call me Mara, which means bitter, for God has dealt very bitterly with me." The reason these stories of disappointment and the consequences of them exist in everywhere from ancient Old Testament texts to Disney Pixar movies is because it's a human experience, isn't it? To face life that comes with some disappointments and what happens to us in that. So I guess the challenge for Christianity is does the message that video we were just watching talk about, does the message that Christmas talks about, the message of joy, does it really offer a joy to people who have been disappointed by life? Well, that is what we turn our attention to this morning. And that's what we're going to read about in the first chapter of the book of Luke. We're going to read we're going to read verse 5 to verse 25. And Ruben is going to read those to us now. So this is Luke chapter 1, verses 5 to 25. Ruben, over to you, mate.
In the days of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah of the division of Abijah. And he had a wife from the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. And they were both righteous before God, walking blamelessly in all the commandments and statutes of the Lord. But they had no child because Elizabeth was barren, and they were both advanced in years. Now while he was serving as a priest before God, when his division was on duty, according to the custom of the priesthood, he was chosen by lot to enter the temple of the Lord and burn incense. And the whole multitude of the people were praying outside at the hour of incense. And there appeared to him an angel of the Lord standing on the right side of the altar of incense. And Zechariah was troubled when he saw him, and fear fell upon him. But the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayers have been heard, and your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you shall call him John. And you will have joy and gladness, and many will rejoice at his birth. For he will be great before the Lord, and he must not drink wine or strong drink, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit, even from his mother's womb. And he may turn many of the children of Israel to the Lord their God, and he will go before him in the spirit and power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, to make ready for the Lord and people prepared." And Zechariah said to the angel, "How shall I know this? For I am an old man, and my wife is advanced in years." And the angel answered him, "I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I was sent to speak to you and to bring you this good news. And behold, you will be silent and unable to speak until the day that these things take place, because you did not believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their time." And people were waiting for Zechariah, and they were wondering at his delay in the temple. And when he came out, he was unable to speak to them. And they realized that he had seen a vision in the temple, and he kept making signs to them and remained mute. And when the time of his service ended, he went to his home. After these days, his wife Elizabeth conceived for 5 months. She kept herself hidden, saying, "Thus the Lord has done for me in the days when he looked on me, to take away my reproach among people."
Brilliant, Ruben. Thank you so much. This is a story of joy coming to people who've been disappointed by life. And we shouldn't get buried in the details so far that we gloss over that so clearly. There is a message here to people who have been disappointed by life. The disappointment that Zechariah and Elizabeth face is one that many people face. The disappointment of childlessness was one that probably it was even more acute to them than it is to many people today, because of the culture in which they lived and the expectations that were placed upon people. You see, I think God has 3 really great things to say in terms of joy to the disappointed in this passage. And the first one is a value. We have this terrible tendency to think that God could really do some great stuff when he uses some really great people. And the thing is, when we do that, we have this inevitable way of defining greatness as people who are a bit better at succeeding in life than we are. So we look at those around us, see those who've accomplished or done or been more fortunate than we have been, and thought, God could do some great things with those kind of people. The thing is, God's track record should show us something that's very different to that. In the Old Testament, God used Naomi's daughter-in-law, who was broke and widowed and far from home. God used a man with a paralyzed right arm. God used the youngest brother in a family who was out in the field looking after the animals whilst the important brothers had all been invited into a big meeting. God used a prophet who ran away from what God directly told him to do. God used a prophet who was bald and other people made fun of him for it. God used a prophet who was so paralyzed by fear that he hid in a cave from his opponents. In the New Testament, God used a teenager who was accused of unfaithfulness even before she was married. God used a tax collector who had betrayed his people. God used a coward who denied that he even knew Jesus 3 times in one night. God used someone who tried to kill other Christians persistently. God used a couple who had felt the pain of childlessness for years and years and years. God has a wonderful habit of using people whose lives have been less than perfect. Let's not bring ourselves into the illusion that God could do some great stuff if he used some great people. And what we mean by great is people who are more successful than us. If you feel like life has been disappointing, if you feel like life hasn't lived up to what you expected, hear this loud and clear: that God values you. That God thinks you are valuable. But as well as valuing people who have been disappointed by life, God also offers, I think, what I would call a reorientation for us all. The words that Ruben was reading for us earlier, and this whole Christmas story might be quite familiar to some of us because it's read in most churches across the world most years. Although maybe it's actually the story that comes directly after the one we've just read that's most familiar to us. The story of the angel appearing to Mary and Mary's news that she's going to give birth to Jesus. If you know those stories well, there might be a question that comes up in what we've been looking at this morning, which is, doesn't Zechariah get a bit of a raw deal? If you were to compare the account of Zechariah and the account of Mary, then you might on the surface have 2 stories that seem rather similar. An angel appears to somebody who is not expecting to hear from an angel. The angel tells those people that they're going to have a baby, even though that would appear to be impossible for both of those people. Both of those people respond by essentially going, "What?" Then Mary is blessed, and Zechariah is made unable to speak for 9 months. Didn't Zechariah get a bit of a raw deal? Well, you have to look more closely at what Zechariah says and compare it with what Mary says to realise why what happened to them was so different. See, when Mary is told by the angel that she's going to give birth to Jesus, she says, "How can this be, since I am a virgin?" She acknowledges God's plans, but says, how will this happen? I'm not qualified. I'm a virgin. I'm not able to fulfill the task that needs to happen for God's plan to come to fruition. I'm the one letting the side down. Zechariah's response is really different from that, though. He says, "How can I know this? How can I be sure of this?" I think the angel Gabriel's response is actually quite funny, where angel Gabriel's response is to say, "I am Gabriel and I stand in the presence of the Lord." Zechariah is saying, "How do I know?" And Gabriel kind of goes, "Duh, you're having a vision of an angel right now. What more do you need?" You see the difference between what the 2 of them are doing. In the story that was unfolding around them, Zechariah was putting himself at centre stage. The most important thing was what he could know. Mary was not putting herself at centre stage. God's purposes were at centre stage, and her concern was how she would fulfil God's purposes. That's the question that I think we're left with at Christmas and with Christianity in general, is who is centre stage in the Christmas story and the Christian story. It's almost a tradition at this time of year that a preacher at some point would go on a little rant about everything they don't like about the modern state of Christmas, about how much they detest the commercialization of it, the chintziness of it, the gluttony. It's difficult for me to do that because, if I'm honest, I really love Christmas. I was happy as Larry putting up decorations yesterday. By my own free choice, I watched Home Alone 1 last night because I love Christmas. And so it would be enormously disingenuous of me to say, oh, moan isn't the kind of modern Christmas experience, all so far away from what it's supposed to be. But I also think there's a more important question going on, not just of what you do at Christmas. There's a more important question of who is centre stage in what goes on at Christmas. Who's at the heart of the story? The story of Christmas is the story of God coming to be with us. When Jesus is called Emmanuel, that's what Emmanuel means. It means God with us. Think about that for a moment. The story of Christmas is God coming to be with us. If you could only capitalise one word in that sentence, which one would it be, honestly? Would it be God or would it be us? Would it be the news that the unbounded, infinite creator and sustainer of the whole universe, who spoke us into being, who sustains our whole lives, who knows all and sees all, is capable to do whatever he wants, he would want to get to know us? That is who should be centre stage in the Christmas story. It is God's story of him coming and us going, who am I that God should be mindful of me? That is why the angels can say, behold, we bring good news of great joy at Christmas, because it is the capitalized, infinite, awesome God of the universe coming to get to know us. Our hope should be that we respond to that God the way that Mary does when she says, behold, I'm a servant of the Lord. This is the second thing that God gives to people who've lived with disappointments. And to some extent or another, we have all lived through disappointments this year. He offers us a reorientation, a chance to move ourselves away from being centre stage of our whole life story, and instead for God to be the centre of the stage and for us to enter into his orbit. But the story is not over yet. The story wasn't over for Zechariah and Elizabeth either. And so we're going to turn our attention to how the story finishes for Zechariah and Elizabeth. We're going to flick down to Luke chapter 1, verses 57 to 66, at the end of this first chapter of Luke's account of Jesus' life. And that, I believe, is going to be read to us now by Neve. So Neve, if you're there, over to you. This is Luke chapter 1, verses 57 to 66.
Now the time came for Elizabeth to give birth, and she bore a son. And her neighbours and relatives heard that the Lord had shown great mercy to her, and they rejoiced with her. And on the 8th day they came to circumcise the child, and they would have called him Zechariah, after his father. But his mother answered, no, he shall be called John. And they said to her, none of your relatives is called by this name. And they made signs to his father, inquiring what he wanted him to be called. And he asked for a writing tablet and wrote, his name is John. And they all wondered. And immediately his mouth was opened and his tongue loosed, and he spoke, blessing God. And fear came on all their neighbours, and all these things were talked about through all the hill country of Judea. And all who heard them laid them up in their hearts, saying, what then will this child be? For the hand of the Lord was with him.
Brilliant. Thank you, Neve. And it was... wasn't that great? And so disappointing that Neve's family weren't able to make quite as much noise in the background as the Burrow family were earlier on. Hey, good luck next time, Batistas. Maybe you can kind of make as much racket with the pans in the kitchen. Anyway, the third thing that I think God offers as a joy to the disappointed is he offers a liberty. Having offered a value, saying, look, if life has been disappointing to you, That does not mean you are less valued by God. After offering a reorientation, a way of seeing the world where we're not at the center of it, but God is, then he also gives us liberty. You see, the challenge of long-term disappointments is often that both the joy and the frustration of others is painful. Here's what I mean. If somebody has struggled with long-term childlessness, like Zachariah and Elizabeth had, it can sting to hear and see people posting the joyous photos of their kids on the beach, because it reminds of the frustration and the disappointment their life has given. But it can also sting to hear other people say about how hard it has been to look after their children through the pandemic, because it's the same kind of reminder. Or if somebody has struggled with singleness for a long time, it can sting to see yet another engagement announcement from others. But it can also sting to hear of somebody complaining about how their partner is driving them up the wall. If somebody has been long-term and consistently frustrated and disappointed with what their workplace is like, it can sting to hear the joyful news of other people's promotions. It can also sting to hear the news of other people complaining about being furloughed from work because, well, you'd kill for a break. Or if you've been frustrated by long-term worklessness, then it can sting to hear the news of people getting jobs. And it can sting to hear people complaining about how frustrating they find their work because, well, you don't even have any. Don't you see that one of the challenges of the long-term disappointments of life, the kind of long-term disappointments that Zachariah and Elizabeth lived with, is that both the good news and the bad news of others can all hurt. Look, in light of that, I think then all of us who experience the kinds of blessing that we know that other people don't always get to experience, and that can hurt others, should probably have a little bit more care and a little bit more concernedness with the words and the posts that we put out. Whether we're celebrating or lamenting the things in our life, we should probably be thinking a little bit more about others than we do. Does that mean that it is a sin to rejoice in the things that God has given you publicly? Absolutely not. But think about these words from 1 Corinthians chapter 10. All things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbour. What if, because we know the world is filled with people who have been disappointed by life, the way we spoke, the things we did, were coloured by a concern for the disappointed, not by a need to put ourselves at centre stage in our story? All that being said, though, there's another thing to say, isn't there? That if it's the case that both the joys and the frustrations of others have a way of stinging, it's never going to be possible for us to sanitize our way out of the problem of dealing with the pain of a life that has been disappointing. If both good news and bad news has a way of stinging, there is no kind of social hand wash that we could use that could truly separate us from all of the interactions that might remind us of the way that life has been disappointing. We need more than some kind of separation. We need something more powerful. We need an inoculation for the infection of comparison. And that is exactly what happens to Zechariah in what we just read. In verses 63 to 64, he communicates just two things: that the child's name is to be John, and he spoke blessings to God. So he took God at his word, and he was filled with praise to God because of it. When we get to the end of this passage, Zechariah is not paying attention to other people and what they are thinking or doing. In verse 25, Elizabeth said how she referred to her predicament was a disgrace amongst other people. That she felt her own sorrow, not just for herself, but because she was disgraced before others. But when it gets to the end of the story, when they're celebrating, when they've taken God at his words, and when they're rejoicing because what God has done, they're not looking sideways, they're looking up. They have been freed. They are liberated from shame and comparison. If you and I try and start each day with our personal security, resting on our own achievements, on how life hasn't really been that disappointing to us, it won't quiet the human conscience. We will inevitably end up discouraged or apathetic or self-righteous. But we need an inoculation for the infection of comparison. And that can come because the faith in God that can warm itself at the fire of God's love for us and of what Jesus has done for us, instead of having to steal love and acceptance from other places, that is a way of joy and peace. That is joy even to the disappointed. That is why the angels said, "Behold, we bring good news of great joy." I think God offers to people who have found life disappointing a value, that you are not defined by how successful your life has been. He offers us a reorientation, a chance to move ourselves away from the centre of the story and find joy in him being at the centre of the story. And he offers us a liberty, a freedom from the plague of comparison, and a chance to look up instead of looking sideways. And if that's what God is offering us, I think that is an arrival of incredible joy. And I hope you agree. In a moment, we're going to have a chance to sing together again, to celebrate that joy by taking communion together. Before we do, I want to read a prayer for you. A prayer that has been written for people who have experienced the disappointment of missing others. It's probably written in a slightly more formal language than most of us are used to praying in, but I hope it blesses you nonetheless. And then we'll worship, led by the band. Let me pray. O God, you created our hearts for unbroken fellowship. Yet the constraints of time and place and the stuttering rhythms of life in a fallen world dictate that our fellowship in these days will at times be broken or complete. So we find ourselves in this season bearing the sorrow of our separation from one another. We praise you also, knowing that these glad aches are a true measure of the bonds you have wrought between our hearts. Now use our sorrow as a tool in your hand, O Lord, shaping our hearts into a truer imitation of the affections of Christ. Use even this sadness to carve out spaces in our souls where still greater repositories of holy affection might be held, unto the end that we might better love in times of absence and in times of presence alike. We now entrust all to your keeping. May our reunion be joyous, whether in this life or in the life to come. How we look forward, O Lord, to the day when all our fellowship will be restored, eternal and unbroken. O come, Emmanuel. Christ our King, how we long for your return. O come, Emmanuel. Christ our Shepherd, how we pine for your voice. O come, Emmanuel. Christ our older brother, how we miss you. Make haste, O Lord, return to us. Amen.